everyone. Welcome to Zoom. Welcome to virtual Greenacre and Bahá'í Publishing Trust. We have teamed up with each other to offer this wonderful webinar with Dr. Robert Stockman for you all today. If you are new to our programming, welcome. Greenacre is a Bahá'í Center of Learning located in Elliott, Maine, on the banks of the beautiful Piscataqua River. This is the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. And if it were not for the pandemic, you would all be here in person or not here, which is actually probably more likely. So in a way, we are grateful for the silver linings of the pandemic, which actually enable us to be with each other from all over the world. So welcome. Greenacre has been involved in discourses of the day since the late 1800s, when Sarah Farmer began gathering people from all different religions and backgrounds and countries together at Greenacre to discuss important matters of the day. And we continue doing that to this day, as well as continuing Baha'i education for those who are interested in that. And we're so lucky today to have Dr. Robert Stockman with us. And in a second here, I will pass the mic over to Chris Martin, who will introduce Robert. And before we get started, I will just start with a prayer. Actually, this is not a prayer. This is actually a writing by Abdu'l-Bahá. And of course, today's talk is about Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to North America. So I think this is actually quite kind of appropriate for the talk we're going to have today. At all times do I speak of you and call you to mind. I pray unto the Lord, with tears I implore him to rain down all these blessings upon you. 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 And gladden your hearts and make blissful your souls, and grant you exceeding joy and heavenly delight. And gladden your hearts and make blissful your souls, and grant you exceeding joy and heavenly delight. At all times do I speak of you and call you to mind. I pray unto the Lord, with tears I implore him to rain down all these blessings upon you. 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 And gladden your hearts and make blissful your souls, and grant you exceeding joy and heavenly delight. And gladden your hearts and make blissful your souls, and grant you exceeding joy and heavenly delight. And gladden your hearts and make blissful your souls, and grant you exceeding joy and heavenly delight. Heavenly delight. Heavenly delight. Heavenly delight. Heavenly delight. How amazing that those are the words of Abdu'l-Bahá to us, that he is speaking of us at all times. And we hope that this webinar today will help you gain a deeper relationship with Abdu'l-Bahá. And with that, I will pass it over to Chris Martin from the Bahá'í Publishing Trust.
Thank you, Jessica. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. I love that.
My pleasure.
Dear friends, Alawapa, the topic for today's seminar of Conversations of the Heart is Abdu'l-Bahá's visit to North America and what it teaches us. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Robert H. Stockman, with whom I've had the bounty of working, as our guest speaker. Dr. Stockman is the director of the Wilmette Institute and has served on the board of World Order magazine. and the Baha'i Encyclopedia Project for several years. He is also an instructor of religious studies at Indiana University South Bend. He obtained his master's degree and doctorate in religious studies from Harvard University, where he specialized in the history of religion in the United States. He is the author of several books, including Abdu'l-Bahá in America, a volume that reviews Abdu'l-Bahá's 8-month journey across North America, and various articles on Baha'i history. During his spare time, if he finds any, he writes science fiction stories for fun. We are very fortunate to hear him today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Stockman.
And so sorry, I forgot to mention, everyone, I'm so sorry. At the end, we will have a time for Q&A. And if you do have questions, please put those in the Q&A box, which if you take your cursor, you will see a little icon at the bottom that says Q&A. Please put your questions in there. Do not put them in the chat box, but we want you to chat with each other. We want to hear your thoughts, your responses to what Dr. Stockman is sharing with us. But if you put your questions in there, they will probably get lost. So sorry for the interruption. Apologies.
Oh, that's fine. That's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Greenacre. Thank you very much, Publishing Trust. Thanks, Jessica and Chris, for your welcome, and thanks for inviting me today. I'm speaking from South Bend, Indiana, which is the land of the Potawatomi Nation, and we have, of course, some connections here with the local tribe as well. Let me share my screen. So I assume everybody can now see my presentation and me as well. I've moved myself over to the presentation screen so that I can look at the screen and look at people at the same time. And I also can't even see myself, which is kind of nice, actually. That way I don't distract myself. My presentation is based on the book that I wrote, Abdu'l-Bahá in America, which came out, of course, in 2012, the centenary of Abdu'l-Bahā's visit. And there's really quite a lot that his visit tells us about what we should be doing today, how we should live, how we should share the faith with others, how we should proclaim the teachings of the faith to the world. And I think really there's quite a lot that from Abdu'l-Bahā's trip that we can learn. Let me figure out how to get my slides to advance here. There we go. This is a quick summary of sort of where he went. He arrived, remember, in April of 1912 and left in December of 1912. So he was here 8 weeks or so, 239 days is one way it's been summarized. And he arrived, of course, in New York City. The first thing he did is go down to Washington and then come back to New York. Go back to New York. And then from Washington, he went to Chicago. Then he went back to Washington and New York. So that was his first trip, was New York, Washington, Chicago, Washington, New York. He made various trips back and forth along the East Coast for a while, went up to Dublin, New Hampshire for about a month. And then from Dublin, in August, he went up to Greenacre, where, of course, Jessica is located today. You can still go pray in the room, or Abdu'l-Bahá stayed in the inn at Greenacre. From Greenacre, he went down to Boston that was his third visit to Boston. Then from there, now you can start following the blue lines. He went to Montreal. From Montreal, he went down to Buffalo, New York, to Chicago, to Kenosha, Wisconsin, up to Minneapolis, St. Paul, down to Nebraska, where he stopped in Lincoln to try and see William Jennings Bryan. Was at that time he was Secretary of State for the United States at that time, but he wasn't home. So Abdu'l-Bahá visited with his wife and daughter. Then he went to Denver, his first visit to Denver. From there, he looped south, which was the only way to get over the Rocky Mountains by train. He was exhausted, stopped in Glenwood Springs, Colorado for 24 hours to recover. Spent a couple of days in Salt Lake City. There were no Baha'is in the city at the time, but there was a giant state fair and all kinds of conferences that he attended. He actually picked up plants there that he took back to Haifa, Acre, because the agricultural fair had a lot of plants that were available. Then he arrived in California, in San Francisco, went down to Los Angeles for a few days, back up to San Francisco, spending a total of 24 days in California. Then he basically retraced his route, the green, coming back. He again stopped in Denver, though he would have stayed on the same route as the blue route. to Chicago for his last visit, on through Cincinnati to Washington, back up to New York City, and then spent his last 3 or 4 weeks in New York City and left in December. So that was his route. You'll note that he did not get to the Pacific Northwest. He wanted to. He invited the Baha'is in Seattle and Spokane and Portland to come down and see him in California because it was just too much to do that. He only visited Washington, D.C. and what we would call the South. That's the only place that he got to that's in the South. There weren't Baha'i communities down there at that time of any size, and so they weren't inviting him. The large communities were basically the places where he visited. So that's a quick summary of his travels. Wrong way. In terms of his activities, he gave talks in lots of different places, many venues, large and small. He gave a lot of talks in homes. When Abdu'l-Bahá traveled to a city, if he would only spend a day or two there, he stayed in a hotel. If he was planning to spend more than a week, say 2 weeks in that city, they generally preferred to rent a house. Why? He could serve tea to his visitors, and nobody would complain if he had people of color visiting him, whereas hotels generally restricted the audiences to whites. So he had a lot of more freedom in rented houses and took advantage of that when he was in San Francisco. He rented a house. In New York City, he rented a house. Both major times he was in New York City. When he was in Washington, D.C., the first time he went there, he stayed in Mrs. Parsons' house because she had actually prepared the house for his visit and had redone the entire house and made a big public area where he could have 100 people or more speak every day. So he did that because she wanted him to. Otherwise, though, he stayed in hotels when he was only in a city for a day or two. He met both with groups of up to 2,000 or 3,000 people on several occasions. He also met with smaller groups, all the Baha'is of Spokane or all the Baha'is of Seattle or all the Baha'is of Portland, a dozen or so. He would meet with them at once. Sometimes he would meet with groups of people, families, and certainly with individuals, and there are plenty of accounts of that. He met quite a few prominent people. There's a long list that you can find. He may have met Teddy Roosevelt, but we're actually not sure. The Guardian refers to him meeting Mr. Roosevelt, but we have not yet determined whether that was Teddy or not, or what day that was. He apparently met with Andrew Carnegie, but we haven't been able to pin down when that happened either, probably his last couple of weeks in New York City. In addition to that, though, he visited settlement houses. Settlement houses were facilities for providing services to the underprivileged, often immigrants, lower middle class. They sometimes provided classes for people to learn English, classes to acquire skills, but they also sometimes had work for people to do. They were able to provide used clothing to people, able to provide food for people. And so his visits to these 7 settlement houses are really an important example of his concern for the poor. He visited 2 summer camps while he was in Dublin, which is also kind of interesting. Sometimes he went out of his way to visit the sick. At one point in New York City, he traveled like 30 miles just to see someone who was ill. It must have taken him most of the day considering the train traffic. Huge numbers of newspaper articles. I had counted over 350 in 1912, and since then, we're finding more, of course, every day on the internet. Public talks, I've been able to count at least 401 public talks. That averages 1.67 per day, but that's definitely an undercount. If you estimate the size of each audience, if you assume in houses it's say 50 or 60, if you assume it's a hall, it's 100 or 200. Some cases we know they're really large ones of several thousand. Put all that in an Excel spreadsheet and add it up, it comes out to 93,000. Now, that, of course, may be an undercount, it may be an overcount, but that gives you at least a rough idea of the size of his cumulative public audiences. 31 liberal Protestant churches invited him to speak. 14 Theosophical and New Thought meetings invited him to speak. No Catholic churches, no more conservative Protestant churches, but at this particular time, there wasn't a sharp distinction between liberal and conservative Protestant. And some of the churches that he spoke to were actually fairly evangelical, though they would today be considered a mainstream denomination. We have really good information about California because Bijou Strawn was hired to spend her days every day with Abdu'l-Bahá as a stenographer, writing everything down. She recorded 48 formal addresses, 41 small group meetings, and 53 interviews with individual people, all in 24 days when Abdu'l-Bahá was in California. That probably gives you a good idea of what we're missing. When I say 401 public talks, well, in 230 days, it sounds like he probably gave many more than that. If you add all these different things up, that's about 2 per day for each one of these things, or 6 per day. So take 239 days and multiply by 6, and that gives you probably a better idea of what he actually was doing. But we really have no way of knowing how to recover all that. It's really amazing. Who else did he talk to? He was invited to speak at 5 universities. He spoke to 3 synagogues. These were, of course, all Reform synagogues. One was in Washington, one was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, one was in San Francisco. He spoke to the 4th annual convention of the NAACP in Chicago. He spoke to the Bethel AME Church's Literary Society. This was, of course, organized by Gregory, who at one point was president of that particular literary society. And there may have been several thousand people, because he may have spoken to them in the main sanctuary of the church. He spoke to rich and poor, high and low, Black, European Americans, Syrian Americans, that is Japanese Americans in California, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, the powerful and the powerless. He spoke to everybody, and he was very careful to speak to everybody. When he was in Boston and when he gave a talk to the Syrian Americans there, he spoke in Arabic to reach them. When he was in California, he spoke to a Japanese congregational church, speaking in Persian, translated spontaneously into English, and that was simultaneously translated into Japanese, and that even got published in a Japanese American newspaper. So it was quite an effort that he made to reach everybody. But he particularly focused on African Americans. In Washington, D.C., my guess is that half the public who heard him speak were African American. It was a significant effort to reach African Americans. This is my sort of theory for how Abdu'l-Bahá worked. He sought to move the uninformed public into the ranks of the interested into the ranks of the inquiring, the inquirers into the ranks of the committed, and the committed into the ranks of the consecrated. So think of it as a centripetal force, a force towards the center being God and Baha'u'llah. And this was what he was trying to do, attract people to the teachings of Baha'u'llah any way he could, to whatever extent they could respond. And I think this is one of our first lessons for today. This, I think, is a good way of describing our own efforts to reach the uninformed, to make them interested, to bring the interested to the ranks of the inquiring, bring the inquiring, in some cases, into the ranks of the committed, and the committed into the ranks of the consecrated. Not all Baha'is, of course, have reached the point of being consecrated. All of us strive to do this. And so I think this is a good way of thinking about what we're trying to do. In the Kitab-i-Agan, Baha'u'llah has a section popularly called the Tablet of the True Seeker, when he talks about the virtues that we should acquire in this life, the actions that we should have, the approach to the divine and to our fellow human beings in this Tablet of the True Seeker. That term True Seeker, by the way, in Arabic is mujahid, someone who performs jihad, a spiritual warrior. And Shoghi Effendi translated it True Seeker, which I think is really quite interesting. I think in many ways, when the House of Justice speaks about protagonists, the protagonists are the beginning of the true seeker, the people who are moving from being the uninformed public to become in the ranks of involved. And that involvement may or may not necessarily mean that they're understanding the faith, but they're beginning to explore virtues and applying those virtues to their own lives. And so I think, in many ways, that's part of our lesson from Abdu'l-Bahá. How do we emulate him in this centripetal force to bring people closer to the revelation? He spoke both to the public and privately to the individual Baha'is. And he didn't always say the same thing to each group also, which is kind of interesting. In his public talks, he emphasized what we often publicly call or frequently call the Baha'i principles, that is, the social teachings of the faith. He initially talked about one only, and then began to talk about two, and then three or four, five or six. As he went across the country, he gave talks that enumerated more and more of them. Ultimately, he gave a talk that up to 11 of them. So it's kind of interesting to see how he kind of unrolls, expands on this notion of social principles as he goes. By the way, he did the same thing in Paris earlier. So it's not like he was exploring and discovering the social principles as he crossed North America. He was strategically deciding which ones to talk about. Typically, he speaks about independent investigation of reality and the oneness of humanity as either number one or number two, and they tend to switch back and forth. Then he often mentions the oneness of religion and science and the abandonment of prejudices. So those often are somewhere around 3 and 4. When you think about it, independent investigation of reality and the oneness of humanity are really two sides of the same coin. Because, as Baha'u'llah says, our first gift that we've been given as human beings is the gift of understanding. It's rational thought. This is what makes us different from the rest of the physical world around us, is this ability to think, to reason. And so this is both the thing that makes it possible for us to investigate reality and the thing that makes us distinctive as human beings and makes us all one as human beings, this ability to reason and to think rationally. And of course, when you apply that very principle of the investigation of reality to religion and science, you see the oneness of them. And when you apply it to ideas around the world in front of you and surrounding you, it leads to the abandonment of prejudices as well. When you look at the other principles he taught, adjustment of economic standards, equality of men and women, universal education, religion being the cause of love and unity, establishing equal standards of human rights, universal language, etc. These kinds of teachings also flow directly from the oneness of humanity. Certainly, equality of all people flows from the oneness of humanity. The need for religion to bring people together and recognize their oneness flows from it as well. Equal standards of human rights and equal economic standards flow from the fact that we're all members of the same species. And so all these teachings, in a sense, all these teachings build on each other and reflect a common vision of how the world works. And I think this is something that is very important for us to realize. One of the common ideas in 1912 in the United States has been described by a scholar as the conflation of race, religion, and progress. This scholar, by the way, is an Iranian-American Shiite who's written a brilliant book on the history of Islam in America, published by Oxford University Press. And he talks about this idea of the conflation of race, religion, and progress. What that means in the 19th and early 20th centuries, what it meant was white Americans felt they were members of the superior race. As Christians, they were members of the superior religion. And as Americans in the most materially wealthy and progressive place in the world, and of course Europe was also this way, they were at the acme of human development and progress. And that it's not a coincidence from their point of view that being white, Christian, and being on top, these are connected. So this was the dominant assumption, the dominant prejudice, shall we say, of American Protestants, that Protestant Christianity, the white race, were superior. Abdu'l-Bahá flips this on its head. He talks about race being the oneness of humanity. So he goes beyond whiteness. He talks about religion being the oneness of religion. So he doesn't put any one faith on top. And he talks about progress being spiritual progress, noting frequently that the United States has achieved a great degree of material progress, but now it must achieve a great level of spiritual progress as well. And this, of course, if anything, is a greater problem today than ever before. We have a society which is turning away from religious values and is becoming seduced by values of superiority of race, nationalism, and these kinds of things are eating away at the fabric of our society and culture. So this was Abdu'l-Bahá's response to the conflation of race, religion, and progress. And as we will see, the world also in many ways did not like these three either. In fact, the Parliament of Religions in 1892 was frequently a place where the Hindus and the Buddhists were pushing back and saying, no, you're not, you guys aren't superior. We are instead. They often were implying that at least. Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, was not polemical. He did not attack people. He did not criticize people. He was gentle in tone. He did not come right out and say, you stupid people, why do you believe these things? That was the kind of thing that Swami Vivekananda had said 20 years earlier. So some of the earlier visits to America by Eastern thinkers were much sharper than Abdu'l-Bahá, which is also, I think, quite an interesting lesson. And of course, a lot of people thought, yes, we believe in the oneness of humanity, as they put it, the brotherhood of man. But did they really believe in the brotherhood of man? Because not all brothers were viewed as equal in this society. There were many highly enlightened people, white people, at this time, who really did not think through the implications of the oneness of humanity. And I think the best example of this was a time Abdu'l-Bahá was in Boston in May of 1912, and he spoke to the Unitarians, the Unitarian Convention, in fact, one day, and 2 days later, he spoke to the Free Religious Association, which was another group of liberal thinkers. They were, and some of them were post-Unitarian. They thought, the Unitarians are great, but we don't even need that. We can do better than that even. And when he was introduced to speak to the Free Religious Association, the man who introduced him said something very interesting. He said, I was walking across Boston Common yesterday with a friend who had gone to the Unitarian Convention talking about Abdu'l-Bahá coming, and my friend said, he didn't say anything that we don't already know. And then this speaker who's introducing Abdu'l-Bahá says, isn't this amazing that someone from Iran believes the same thing we believe? Well, is that true? Would these people have been willing to have one of their children marry an African American? I don't think so. They were perfectly happy for African Americans to wash their clothes and clean their houses and cook their food, but probably not much else. There, of course, were exceptions. There were some churches that were actually racially integrated in those days, but not very many. Abdu'l-Bahá, while he may have been talking about the oneness of humanity in the abstract to these white audiences, was, of course, meanwhile, matchmaking between Louis Gregory and Luisa Matthew. And he started that quite early. He had met them both in 1910 when they were on pilgrimage in Egypt, when Abdu'l-Bahá was in Egypt. And so when he's on his way to the United States, he writes Luisa Matthew in England and says, why don't you come with me to America? So she takes the train down to Naples and gets on the boat in Naples in Italy, where Abdu'l-Bahá's steamer was stopping for a few days, comes to America, and he keeps her and Louis Gregory in his entourage in New York City, and then on down to Washington, D.C., and then on to Chicago. He's got both of them with him as part of his group of people who are traveling. Abdu'l-Bahá often would do this. He would invite people to join him. He would have them accompany him so that he could accompany them, you might say. And of course, you probably all know the story about how he would sort of make hints to both of them. And finally, Luisa came out, asked him directly. And we even have the recorded notes of the Persian woman who translated for her between Persian and English. Okay, Qudsiye Khanum Ashraf, who was in the United States, and Luisa wanted a woman to be a translator, so she asked Qudsiye Khanum to come translate. And so Qudsiye Khanum says that she asked, do you think I should marry Mr. Gregory? But he has to ask me. And Abdu'l-Bahá says, if he loves you, he will ask you. And then, of course, Abdu'l-Bahá meets with Louis Gregory a few hours later and kind of brings up the subject. And according to Qudsiye Khanum Ashraf, when it occurred to Louis Gregory what Abdu'l-Bahá had in mind, He went out and walked the streets of Chicago for several hours thinking about this suggestion of his master. That was May, and of course they got married in September. So Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged this interracial marriage because this was the real way to break the color barrier, not only in the country, but in the Baha'i community, because this was something the American Baha'is had to deal with for the next 30 years, 40 years. They had to deal with an interracial couple in their midst. And this forced them to think about what it was their religion really stood for. And this was not easy for the Baha'is. So here they are. I think this may be on their wedding day. When Abdu'l-Bahá was in Dublin, New Hampshire that was August, he met with all the African-American servants in Dublin. He couldn't get anybody to offer a room where he could meet with them, so he had to meet with them in the boathouse down on the shores of Lake Dublin. Interestingly enough, that boathouse still exists as far as I know, but the houses don't. And they were very pleased to hear about the interracial marriage. Needless to say, he did not mention interracial marriage to his white audiences, but he did to his African-American audiences. Abdu'l-Bahá also spoke extensively about the equality of men and women. He said that they have often come off as being unequal because of a lack of education, and if they had education, they could do anything men could do. They may be physically weaker, but nowadays with machines, that doesn't matter anymore. He even went so far as to say that women could make perfectly good combat soldiers as men, which I think is quite an interesting statement nowadays. He said, God forbid that this has to happen. Better that nobody is a combat soldier, but the women could do that if they had to. And of course, he advocated quite explicitly votes for women. In 1912, this is 8 years before women were given the vote nationally. I think in 1912, California gave women the vote. They had already received the vote in Wyoming and Utah earlier. Utah first, but then Utah took it back and then gave it to them again in 1895. New Zealand had given women the vote at this point also, but most of the world, of course, they didn't have the right to vote, and they didn't get it in England until a little after this time too, though before 1912. And interestingly enough, New York, which you'd think would be a very progressive place, Tammany Hall, which ran New York City, was opposed to votes for women because they realized women would probably vote for reform and then they would lose power. And of course, eventually they did, and women did get the vote, the right to vote. This made headlines, Abdu'l-Bahā's support for votes for women. At least 6 times in North America, Abdu'l-Bahá said that Europe was a powder keg and a much more destructive war there was coming soon. This was a fairly unthinkable idea, believe it or not, in 1912. We do hear Swami Vivekananda commenting about, for example, how Europe is a powder keg, but he never predicted war. Most people in those days did not think that a war was possible. The Protestant thinkers, white Protestant thinkers, felt that they had now more or less achieved Christian civilization. Christian civilization was enlightened, and therefore a major internal war amongst Christians was not something that was very likely and very unlikely to happen. World War I was an utter shock to the vast majority of white Christian intellectuals in the United States and in Europe. It destroyed their sense of optimism, their sense of the perfectibility of human beings. And subsequently, after the war, you have the rise of what's called neo-orthodoxy, which emphasized original sin and the basic sinfulness of human beings. An idea, of course, that the evangelicals had all along, but liberal Protestants dominated thinking in the United States at this time until World War I. And this, of course, also blows out of the water the conflation of race, religion, and progress. You can't believe that you're the superior race in the superior religion when Christian boys are killing each other on the fields of France and Belgium. And so that put one nail in the coffin of the idea of the conflation of race, religion, and progress. And Hitler, you might say, finished nailing the coffin shut, because here you have the extreme example of this racist idea of superiority and what it does. Who did Abdu'l-Bahá influence? We talked a little bit about his ideas. You wouldn't say he had a huge influence amongst white thinkers. In England, there was a man named Thomas Kelly Shaney, a prominent biblical scholar, and after he met Abdu'l-Bahá and he became a Baha'i, he wrote this book, The Reconciliation of Races and Religions, and then interestingly enough, passed away just a year later in 1913. So Thomas Kelly Shaney is one example of someone whose thought was influenced by Abdu'l-Bahá. Albert Léon Gerard, Stanford professor of French and English, who was there all the way up to the 1940s when Firuz Kazemzadeh and Amin Banani were undergraduates, and they met him there. Gerard became a strong supporter of world government, of the need for an international language, published about these topics, and even published in World Order magazine in the 30s on these subjects. And after World War II, the president of the University of Chicago called a group of people together to draft a world constitution, and he was invited to participate in that effort. Of course, that never went anywhere. But he was a thinker whose ideas seem to have been influenced by Abdu'l-Bahá, to some extent at least. But if the whites weren't influenced as much as we might like, the African-American thinkers, they had a much bigger impression of Abdu'l-Bahá. He made a much bigger impact on the African-American community than on the white community, intellectually speaking. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, is one of the most famous African-Americans ever lived. And Du Bois at that time was publishing The Crisis, which was a monthly magazine that was sold widely across the United States. And in May of 1912, he declared Abdu'l-Bahá the Man of the Month. Normally, the Man of the Month was an African-American individual or perhaps a group, a young group of college graduates from a particular school or something. Every month there was a Man of the Month. And Abdu'l-Bahá was the Man of the Month, one of the few places where a white person, if you want to call Abdu'l-Bahá white, because that actually, we would automatically think that today, but in 1912, you could question that idea. The definition of whiteness was not as definite as it is today. So Abdu'l-Bahá was included, and in May and in June of 1912, W.E. Du Bois summarized Abdu'l-Bahā's talks to the NAACP and to Hull House in Chicago. So you have these clear impressions of Abdu'l-Bahá, and Du Bois's first wife later becomes a Baha'i as well. Not his second wife, but his first wife. So clearly, Abdu'l-Bahá had a big impact on Du Bois, who of course knew Louis Gregory well and remained interested in the faith throughout his life. Then you have Robert Abbott, who was the publisher of the Chicago Defender, sometimes called America's Black newspaper, probably the most prominent African-American newspaper in the United States. And he was very impressed by Abdu'l-Bahá. And when he was retiring from the Chicago Defender, when he no longer was, shall we say, involved in politics, he became a Baha'i. I think that was in the mid-20s or so. So he was an extremely important voice in the African-American community who also, of course, became Baha'i. Elaine Locke, of course, did not become a Baha'i until 1918 and never met Abdu'l-Bahá, but Locke's interest in the faith would not have been possible without the groundwork laid by all these Baha'is, reaching out to African Americans, learning about African American culture, becoming appreciative of it, trying to free themselves from prejudices, and of course with Louis Gregory helping to lead the community forward in terms of race unity. People like Elaine Locke could be attracted. He was the leading professor of philosophy at Howard University. He was one of the leading figures in the Harlem Renaissance. He's often called the dean of the Harlem Renaissance. He's the man who coined the term, well, not just him, there was also Kaplan, who was a Jewish friend of his. They were at Oxford together as Rhodes Scholars, and I guess it was Kaplan coined the term multiculturalism. So Elaine Locke was involved even in that notion. Things that we take for granted today are ideas that he helped to popularize, intellectual ideas. So Elaine Locke is a towering example of Abdu'l-Bahā's ultimate influence on the African-American community. And there's actually a lot of research that still needs to be done on the impact of Abdu'l-Bahá on race and the impact of Abdu'l-Bahá on women's rights. There's no research has been done on that at all. And I think there's probably a lot of material in archives about women's groups that still needs to be found. So someone should research that. Abdu'l-Bahá, of course, Abdu'l-Bahá helped build the American Baha'i community. When he arrived, there were between 1,000 and 2,000 Baha'is, depending on how you count them. And it's very hard to say how to count them because there was no enrollment process, there were no voting lists. Some communities were more sharply defined, some were less sharply defined. In 1906, the United States government did a religious census. They wrote all the denominations and said, can you tell us, how many churches you have and how many congregants and how many people attend your Sunday school classes. They were called scholars, by the way, the kids who go to Sunday school. And so the US Census collected this information, and the Washington Baha'is had the American Baha'is collected, and they came up with 1,500 Baha'is. In 1916, they said 2,500, but I think they were defining it more loosely. And in 1926, 1,200. So I think they were beginning to define the term more tightly at that time. So the number of Baha'is in the United States was between 1,000 and 2,000, probably, depending on how you counted them. And his ideas, his talks had a great impact on these people. He sent Howard Mcnutt, New York Baha'i, to Chicago to tell the Chicago Baha'is to re-elect their 9-member House of Spirituality. This was their local assembly. There was a person who was a potential covenant breaker involved in the community, and Abdu'l-Bahá instructed them basically not to elect people with certain qualities, and this gentleman was not then elected to the House of Spirituality subsequently. He met with the New York Spiritual Assembly. It was called the Board of Council at the time. And so he worked with both of these bodies to try to strengthen them. He laid the cornerstone, of course, of the house of worship, and this picture shows him right by the cornerstone there and at his feet. And that, of course, was an amazing ceremony on May 1st of 1912 that occurred in this big open field where today we have a house of worship and beautiful gardens and fountains. In terms of enrollments, I'm not aware of large numbers of people who became Baha'is. I have been able to count 25 people who became Baha'is, and I suspect it was probably a bit more than that, so I'm saying 50. So there was 50 new members in 1 year isn't bad for a community of only 1,000 people. But his impact was much bigger than just that. If you look at the historical record cards that the Baha'is filled out in 1934, and you look at, who says what year they became a Baha'i, lots of children of Baha'is put down 1912 for the year they became a Baha'i. They were 6, they were 8, they were 10, but they're putting 1912 down. Why? Abdu'l-Bahā's presence. It had a huge impact on the kids, clearly. He met with children's classes and youth groups everywhere he went. Most Baha'i communities had children's classes, and he met with them. For the adults, they had to think very, very deeply what it was that they had joined. And certainly the marriage of the Gregorys was part of that. And I'll tell you a story about Howard Mcnutt. He was one of the first Baha'is in New York City, one of the most dedicated Baha'is in the country. But he was a man, before Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to the United States, a man with racial prejudices, strong racial prejudices. There are in the archives, I think they were in the New York archives at the time I saw them, a whole bunch of postcards that he would send to his friends, which had gotten preserved in the New York archives. And these postcards often show African-American characters in cartoon positions doing demeaning things or saying stupid things on one side. And on the back is his little note, how are you? What's new to you? That sort of thing, his little postcards. Quite shocking that these images would appear on postcards mailed by a Baha'i. He even writes a letter to a Baha'i friend of his, Hooper Harris, who was in India at the time with Harlan Ober. This was, I think, 1906. And it's a long letter, and he says, let me tell you some darky jokes, but don't share them with Harlan, because Harlan, after all, was from New England, whereas Hooper was from Alabama. And he proceeds to tell some terrible jokes. Well, he clearly learned when Abdu'l-Bahá came to the United States, this was not acceptable, because if you ever see the pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá, the moving pictures of Abdu'l-Bahá, and you see him with African-American children, for example, this is in Howard Mcnutt's front yard where these pictures were taken. And after Howard Mcnutt retired, he went to Miami, Florida. He and his wife moved into a house near the Black neighborhood and they started meetings in the Black neighborhood to teach the faith to African Americans. So Howard Mcnutt had to change. He learned something from Abdu'l-Bahá's visit. And I think you can multiply that story 100-fold by what other people learned from Abdu'l-Bahá's visit. He sought to heal divisions also between people who saw the faith as an independent religion and those who just saw it as a reform movement within other faiths. And this is not something we think about much today, but the Baha'i community had both of these groups, and there was a lot of tension between them at times. I think the best story about that I can think of is a story about Louise Waite, who was a Chicago Baha'i, who was known to write beautiful Baha'i hymns. These hymns would be on Baha'i themes, but of course they sounded very much like white Protestant hymns because this was the music that white community had grown up with. So she was writing these Baha'i hymns about the hidden words, about prayers and Baha'i ideas and that sort of thing. And they often would have the word Allahu Abha in them and that sort of thing. There was an English Baha'i who came to her and said that she should stop writing these hymns because they're pulling the Baha'is away from the churches. They're making it harder for the Baha'is to go participate in church worship. It's making them kind of distinctive in the way they're thinking, and that this is going to pull the Baha'is out away from mixing with the world and make them too distinctive. So Louise Waite felt terrible about this, and she went to Abdu'l-Bahá and asked Abdu'l-Bahá about this, and he assured her she should continue to write the hymns that she was writing, that they were beautiful. And when she asked him about this particular individual who said these things to her, he said not to worry about it. She was young in the kingdom. So Abdu'l-Bahá was very kind about this person's lack of understanding of the faith and was trying to, again, heal the rift. No doubt he later was speaking to her as well, because he often would then meet with individuals spontaneously. He'd say, I want to speak to such and such a person, and he would meet with them and say something life-changing to them. So this is the sorts of things Abdu'l-Bahá would do. He stressed teaching the faith very strongly, stressed love and service to others, the importance of attracting people through your example. But since there were Baha'is very few places around the world, he encouraged the American Baha'is to travel and take the faith to new places. And of course, all of this lays the groundwork for the Tablets of the Divine Plan. 1916 to 1917, during World War I, he's writing these tablets to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. Some of them arrive on postcards during the war. The others don't arrive until after the war because there's no mail between the Ottoman Empire and the United States. They're on the opposite sides of the war while the war is going on. It was really Abdu'l-Bahá's visit that made the Tablets of the Divine Plan a practical thing to ask the American Baha'is to do. He laid the foundation for them to be able to think about these ideas. And so the Tablets of the Divine Plan in many ways were really made possible because of this. And if you think about this, this was the framework of action that the Baha'is were called upon at this time. Love others, teach the faith, proclaim the faith, go out and talk about the faith in public forums whenever possible, and travel, open other places to the faith. That was the framework of action. And that framework of action, of course, carried us forward right up to the 1990s when we began to develop a new framework of action involving neighborhoods and villages and reaching out and being able to build not just Baha'i communities, but communities of interest where people are learning how to serve others, becoming protagonists, moving in the direction of becoming true seekers. So this was the framework of action at the time. His talks to the Baha'i audiences, it's interesting what topics he talks about when he's talking privately. You might say he lets his hair down. He doesn't talk about the 12 principles as much, but he talks about the Persian believers, the persecution they've experienced, the martyrdoms they've experienced, and their steadfastness. He talks about teaching the faith to others strongly. He talks about the importance of the covenant and faithfulness to the covenant. He talks about himself being the center of the covenant. And he mentions the future Universal House of Justice and how the future Universal House of Justice will continue the faith moving forward. He does not mention the guardianship because at this time, his grandson Shoghi Effendi is 14 years old, and he does not want anything to happen, 14 going on 15. So he does not want anything to, disturb his grandson. His comments about the House of Justice, of course, anticipate the will and testament. The Baha'is, when the master passed away, they knew about the House of Justice already. And of course, people knew about it all the way up to the passing of Shoghi Effendi. It was at that point, when there were enough national assemblies, that it was possible to elect the House of Justice. And so again, not only the tablets of the divine plan, but the will and testament was also something that Abdu'l-Bahá had prepared the Baha'is for. In many ways, his trip to America was a preparation for the guardianship and for the administrative order in some ways. His legacy, this is my last slide. Generations of Baha'is have been inspired by his visit to not only serve the faith, but also to serve humanity more accurately, more actively, more deeply. People who are not Baha'is, but want to change the world, can draw great inspiration from his talks and from the vision of the world that they convey to us. And the dearly beleaguered Baha'is in Iran will soon find, the day will come, when their Muslim co-citizens of this country will come to appreciate Abdu'l-Bahā's teachings about human rights, equality, tolerance, and nonviolence. These are teachings of Abdu'l-Bahā's that will eventually be very important, I think, for the future of Iran as well. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll stop sharing my slides here.
It was very enlightening. That was great. I was glued the whole time to the screen. Well, friends, I think we do have some questions here. Many people were inspired while Rob was giving his talk to immediately start writing questions in the Q&A. We're going to try to go through those. If we don't get to your question, or if I'm going to try to make sure that I don't skip any questions, but if we don't get to your questions, or if I accidentally skip it, please accept my apologies in advance. It's not a reflection on your question at all. So I'm going to start right up at the very top of the list. The very first question is, Rob, did the master go to Gyersville, California, where the Baha'i school was later created by the Bosch family?
Not that I know of. He went from San Francisco across the bay to Berkeley frequently. He went to Pleasanton. He went down to Stanford. There are rumors that he went to Santa Cruz, but I've never found any real evidence that he went to Santa Cruz. And I don't know of him going north, because he would have taken a ferry boat. Of course, the San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge behind you there didn't exist. And I haven't heard of him ever traveling into Marin County or farther north. But he might have. I don't know. You never know what information one will find.
Okay. Next question is, can you give us some insight into how the master balanced his personal humility with his authority as center of the covenant?
Well, I think the answer to that question is he did it infallibly. I'm not quite sure what else to say other than the fact that I'm sure he had divine guidance about how to do that. There are times when he could get angry. When someone tried to cheat him in a taxi in Montreal, and they're actually grabbing him and shaking him, and he's refusing to give them the money because they're charging too much. So Abdu'l-Bahá could be really quite strong and quite insistent when he had to be. But generally speaking, it was the charisma of his love, I think, that generally brought people around. And it's very interesting, I'm not sure this answers your question exactly, but someone once made the interesting point that when he was around purely sort of secular audiences, like intellectual parties in Washington, D.C. or Dublin, New Hampshire, he knew how to be the perfect, charming guest, telling funny stories. Not emphasizing spiritual things at all, but just telling funny stories and making people happy. So he had an interesting way of, meaningful conversation was something that he could somehow weave in more indirectly, you might say, in his conversations with people, and he knew how to set people at ease and make them happy. And I think he tried to focus on that often more than anything else. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, because I don't know if there's an easy way of answering that question.
Yeah, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
That sounded good to me. That answer was good, I thought. Do we have any records of the master meeting or encountering Native Americans during his visit to North America?
Thank you for asking that.
That's a very important question and a very interesting question. There was a man in Chicago named Honoré Joseph Jackson who often claimed Native heritage, who probably wasn't. And he met Abdu'l-Bahá a lot. He was very concerned about American Indian matters, Native matters. He was Canadian, First Nations matters. Whether he introduced Abdu'l-Bahá to any American Indians specifically, we don't know. I haven't heard of. I think he's the one who turned the ground over at the House of Worship on behalf of American Indians, because I think someone did. Honoré Joseph Jackson, you might say he was kind of an honorary Native. He wasn't, like I said, he was actually born William Henry Jackson. He was a British Canadian settler to Ontario who moved out to Saskatchewan when Louis Riel was leading a rebellion against the British of the Métis and the Indians. And he became Louis Riel's English secretary and helped organize the rebellion. And then after the British managed to get an army out there, if you can imagine how hard it was to get an army to Saskatchewan in 1869, no railroad, they had to go across they had to wait for the Great Lakes to melt, right? Float across Lake Superior to the end and then march the rest of the way. And they defeated Louis Riel and they hanged him, and they considered Jackson to be simply insane, because why would any British Anglophone person do this? And he then escaped and came south. So he's an interesting character because he clearly loved and identified with the native peoples. He often would represent them at gatherings and things. But he himself does not seem to have had any native blood. And we don't know about anyone else at the moment. Of course, probably many of the African Americans Abdu'l-Bahá met had native blood in them too, because it's very common amongst Native African Americans to have some American Indian heritage.
This next question goes to the other side of the pond now. It starts, I'm so grateful to Rob for all of his research and articulations of Baha'i history. We based much of our script for Luminous Journey on his work. Now we are working on the story of his visit to France. Rob, do you know anything about Abdu'l-Bahá visiting the legislature in France?
No, I mean, there's that famous story about Abdu'l-Bahá going there and calling it comedy. And Anne knows who to talk to ask about those kinds of questions. I mean, there's various people in France who might be able to answer that question. Jan Yassian, who's in Paris, and goodness, there's several other people there who've done a lot of research on Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to Paris. So if anyone knows, the French Baha'is would know, and she knows how to get a hold of them. The National Center is on Rue Pergolese. She knows, probably been there too. Go ahead, what else? What other questions? Because I can't help with that one much. Well, I will say something else about Paris, which is interesting. Abdu'l-Bahá spent more time in Paris and in New York than anywhere else. And he spent more time in Paris than he spent in New York, I'm pretty sure. Paris became his headquarters for his European visit. And it's probably because there were more people he could meet there than anywhere else, even more than London, which I find is kind of interesting. Anyway.
What did Abdu'l-Bahá think of the concept of being born again, in quotes?
Well, I think you could say in many ways, the Baha'i faith defines that idea as acceptance of the manifestation of God. And acceptance of the manifestation of God for this day is something that for some people is a gentle experience and for some people is a shocking and jolting experience. And Christians have found that that's also true of the born again experience. Some people are twice born, and some people, they say, are once born. And probably the example of the once born was Thomas Aquinas, who was a devoted Christian, but went into a monastery when he was like 6 or 8 years old and never had any kind of enlightenment experience, just was raised, you know, in that stream of thought and devotion. So I think you find that true among the Baha'is as well. Some have a moment of convincement, and some are just always convinced.
Could you speak to the significance of the talk given at the Jewish synagogue in San Francisco?
He seems to have said this pretty much the same kind of a thing in Washington, D.C., by the way. And I wish we had a transcript for his talk in the synagogue in Minnesota, because my guess is it would have been also the same. And he said something similar at the Plymouth Congregational Church in New York. He speaks in all these different places about the need to accept all the manifestations of God. And he doesn't mention Muhammad strongly. Well, he mentions Muhammad strongly at the Plymouth church. He doesn't have to tell anybody about Jesus, of course, at the Plymouth church in New York City. But at the synagogues, he talked about the importance of Jews accepting Jesus and Muhammad. This, in our modern way of looking at it, is quite shocking and can come off even as almost anti-Semitic. Abdu'l-Bahá does not seem to be advocating that they become Christians or Muslims, however. He seems to have been advocating that people should always recognize the truth wherever it comes from, and that if there's a prejudice in your community against Jesus, you need to overcome that prejudice in order to be able to accept the truths that Jesus revealed as a source of truth. And I think that's probably what Abdu'l-Bahá was trying to do. I'm very lucky that a friend of mine at Boston University, Steve Prothero, has written a book called The American Jesus that came out just about the right time, 2010 or so. And he talks a lot about American Jewish attitudes towards Jesus in his book. So this was really helpful for me, because this was a question that rabbis had to deal with a lot. And they would often go give talks at liberal Protestant churches about Jesus, for example. Sort of Jesus, the good Jewish boy kind of thing. So Abdu'l-Bahá, I think, was probably working within that vein of thought. And of course, post-Holocaust, all this stuff is tinted very differently than it was before. The rabbi in San Francisco understood Abdu'l-Bahā's point and was not particularly upset. He had spent time in Jerusalem. He met Abdu'l-Bahá and spoke to Abdu'l-Bahá in Arabic before Abdu'l-Bahá began to speak. So Rabbi Stephen Wise was quite a scholar that way. Rabbi Meyer in New York, in Washington, was quite upset about the talk, which was a very similar talk. So Abdu'l-Bahá then meets with the rabbi the next day. And I have the details in my book. I can't remember whether it's from Mahmoud's diary or from some other source, where he tells the rabbi that it is a very important thing that the Jews understand and sort of accept Christ, because otherwise in the future there will be great trouble for them. So there's almost an anticipation of the Holocaust implied in some of Abdu'l-Bahā's statements to the rabbi, which is, I think, very interesting.
Wow.
I don't think he was saying, you guys got to stop being Jews and become Christians and you won't have any trouble. I don't think he was saying that. I think he was saying that in the context of Jews reconciling with Christians and Christians reconciling themselves with Jews, anti-Semitism will go away. I think it's more like that. But it's very hard to know exactly what was going on, the details. We don't have all the details of the conversations, and that's the best I can do.
Did Abdu'l-Bahá ever meet with individuals that were in some way disabled? Did he have the opportunity to meet Helen Keller, the blind deaf woman?
I don't think he ever met Helen Keller. I have not seen any reference to that. I don't know how old she would have been at that time or where she was living at that time. We'd have to do a little research on that. He certainly would have met people whom people in those days would have called crippled, you know, that would have been the term. People with missing arms and legs, people with disabilities in that sense. And of course, nowadays, in those days, those kinds of disabilities were far more common. Nowadays, people can have hip replacements, they can have knee replacements, and can get around fairly well. But you know, people were far more debilitated in the past. So I'm sure he met plenty of people who were debilitated from age or age-related problems. Certainly with sight and hearing problems, because those also were more common and harder to treat in those days compared to today. He never visited a deaf college that I'm aware of. I suppose that, what's the name of it? Gaudet outside of Washington probably existed, but I don't know that he visited them. Generally speaking, the facilities for the blind and the deaf were not as well developed as they are today. They weren't seeing eye dogs and those kinds of potential supports that people can get today. And there wasn't the integration of people with disabilities into society that exists today as well. But so no, I don't have any specific examples. Certainly he spent his time visiting people who were ill, and that is, I think, the closest I can think of.
Let's see, coming down here, how were pre-arrangements made for the many talks and meetings for Abdu'l-Bahá and arrangements for his itinerary?
That's a really interesting question, actually. He sent Ahmad Sohrab to the United States ahead of time with what you might call a media package. And so Sohrab went to newspapers, he went to prominent organizations, and arranged for Abdu'l-Bahá to receive invitations to speak. So Abdu'l-Bahá was invited to speak at the Lake Mohonk conference before he arrived. He was invited to speak at the Temple Church. What do I put the name of the church in Philadelphia, which founded Temple University? I can't remember its name now. The guy who established that particular church was a very, very famous Protestant minister, and his invitation arrived by cable while Abdu'l-Bahá was passing through the Straits of Gibraltar. So there was a real effort to arrange these things ahead of time. When Abdu'l-Bahá was, for example, when he was in Washington, when he was in Chicago, and he was on his way east, he went first to, that was Cleveland, I think it was. He sent a party ahead of him, one day ahead of him, which consisted of Robarts, Elizabeth Robarts, was that her name? I can't remember her first name. Grace Robarts. Grace Robarts arrived a day ahead of time, made sure that there was hotel arrangements made, made sure the Baha'is were ready, made sure there was a place for a talk, etc. So and presumably even before that, of course, there was correspondence saying he's coming. So there was a plan this way. And sometimes the plans were, well, I think probably usually a few days to a week or two in advance. When Abdu'l-Bahá, for example, went to Boston from Green Acre, there had already been correspondence with the Boston Baha'is that he wanted to stay in a house and not a hotel. And so Maria Wilson vacated her house for Abdu'l-Bahá to be able to stay in it in Malden. And so that was all prearranged. And mind you, this was a tiny house and they fit like 12 people into it. And they converted the entire attic into a giant dorm for all the men. So it wasn't necessarily comfortable. On a day-to-day basis, Abdu'l-Bahá was often quite spontaneous. People would say, could Abdu'l-Bahá visit me? And they'd say, well, you know, we can't really tell you that, and maybe he will, and maybe he won't. And then sometimes he would just simply turn to someone and says, yes, I will be there tomorrow. I'm coming to your house tomorrow. Even sometimes he wouldn't invite him, and he knew that they wanted him to come. And so I'll be there, you know. So it was very spontaneous on a day-to-day basis, but planned in terms of the itinerary when he was going from place to place. Probably one of the best examples of this actually is the house of worship when he went to lay the cornerstone. He was 2 or 3 hours late. because he had a press conference in downtown Chicago, because he had to meet people. And then when he gets out to Evanston to lay the cornerstone, of course, Mrs. True's son had just died. And so he immediately wants them to find Mrs. True and bring her to him so he can comfort her before he comes to lay the cornerstone. But he's like 3 hours late. But nobody really minded. They were all wrapped up in their coats. It was a cold May 1st. Wrapped up in their coats. You look at the pictures, there are no leaves on the trees on May 1st that year.
Someone posted a statistic about interracial marriage at that time. That's wonderful. Please share that in the chat, because we can't really, it's hard really to read that website out here now. There's a nice website there. So
I did take a look at that website, and it means now, not back then.
Oh, not back then. Okay, sorry.
It existed, but it wasn't terribly common. There was a very prominent activist in Chicago. I think what her name was now. Goodness, they had a whole bunch of houses, housing development named for her, that they finally torn down because they got too old. But she was, and she later sort of became a Baha'i for a while, but she was Black, married to a white man. And they were attending a sort of interracial church in Chicago. So there was some interracial mixing and some progress towards desegregation, but it was obviously very limited in those days. And interracial marriage was not illegal in about half the states of the United States, but it was illegal in about half.
Mm-hmm.
So that made it very hard for the Gregorys. They could live in Washington, D.C., but they couldn't go into Virginia together. They could go north up into Maryland, all the way up to Boston and Maine and such. But they couldn't head south. They couldn't tour the South together. So whenever Mr. Gregory went south, he had to go without her.
Mm-hmm.
And she spent many of her times when he was traveling in the South, she was traveling in Europe teaching the faith. She was one of the leading traveling teachers in Europe.
This question is, it's similar to the last one. The question is, do we know who funded Abdu'l-Bahá's 239-day journey within the United States?
My joke answer is he funded it with MasterCard. but no, the answer is Huquq'ullah.
Mm.
Oh, it was Huquq'ullah. He had the Huquq'ullah funds from the Friends. He arrived with a sum of money. I don't know how much he arrived with, but he wasn't planning to stay as long as he stayed. He was originally planning to leave maybe in September, and when he extended it to December, he needed more money. And so Ali Nakhjavani's father, Ali Akbar Nakhjavani, comes to the United States. I think two of them come to the United States, and they bring money and rice. So that was July. I guess he couldn't get good rice. So that's Huquq'ullah is the answer, I think.
Okay, I've always wondered that too, so I was really glad that somebody asked. Thank you.
He steadfastly refused contributions from the Americans, repeatedly refused it, and refused presents as well. He said, give it to the poor. And of course, when he went to the Bowery in New York, he gave away, I think it was like $250. Now, mind you, in $1912, yeah, it was, I think, $250. Now, mind you, a poor person in those days, Ford workers earned $3 a day. Okay, and they worked 6 days a week, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about $700 or $800 a year. And then Ford raised the salary to $5 a day, and people were shocked that he did it. He did it because he wanted them to, feel devoted to the work because it was so repetitive. The assembly lines were so repetitive, and he could make so much money with those assembly lines, he'd raise the price, raise the salary. But the blue collar workers earned $600 a year. White collar workers, $1,200, $1,500 a year, something like that. And he gave away, I think it's like $200, something like, all in quarters.
Next question is, do we know who was the highly placed official, in quotes, in the U.S. government to whom Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about the eventual application of the principle of federalism in relation with other countries, which is cited by Shoghi Effendi in the closing paragraphs of the Advent of Divine Justice?
I don't know. I don't know. No, I think he may have made those kinds of comments to various people, though. I know that when he went to Phoebe Hearst's house for several days in the Bay Area, her son, William Randolph Hearst, was there, and he wanted to run for president. He later on was in Congress. And Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about the spiritual qualities necessary for someone to be president. Maybe that discouraged him from running for president. I don't know. I don't know. But I don't know the answer to that question, no.
Can you say something about Cora Calhoun Horn, Lena Horne's grandmother, and her role in the early Baha'i community, race relations, and women's suffrage?
No, I don't know anything about that at all, I'm afraid. I don't even know about her being a Baha'i right offhand. I don't have information on everybody. I do have a little card file here next to me, which I put together in the 80s with the names of people who became Baha'is, but sometimes all I have is a name, and I don't even know if she's in that list. Unfortunately, I put that information together 40 years ago. It's getting very hard to remember.
You're saying you don't know all things?
No, unfortunately not. No, I rely on Google for that.
Yeah, right.
Maybe we can just combine the next two questions because they're both about meeting people. Do you have specific information about Juanita Storch, who met Abdu'l-Bahá in California? That's the first one. And the second one is, do you know very much about his meeting with J.P. Morgan, the banker?
With Morgan, I'm not even sure he met Morgan. I mean, I think he's listed as having met Morgan, but I've never been able to pin down when he met Morgan because it's not in Mahmoud's diary. So I don't say anything about it at all in my book because my book is chronological. If I can't pin down when something happened, I generally didn't mention it at all. With Juanita Storch, I can't say very much about it, except Juanita Storch was, I think, 15 at the time or 16, and she kept a diary. And in, what year was it? Maybe it wasn't 2012. Maybe it was 92 or 2002. World Order magazine published Juanita Storch's diary about meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. It's a very, very sweet account of a teenage girl and her meeting the master. And so there's that published in World Order magazine. And you can find World Order now on the web, at Baha'i.works. So you can probably search it and find Juanita Storch's diary that way.
And Ann Perry is saying he went to J.P. Morgan's library and left a message for him.
Yes, that's what it says in Mahmoud's diary, but unfortunately I don't have the day, so.
You were mentioning his quick stop in Omaha. He went to go visit a politician of some sort.
Right.
My best friend is actually his ancestor who became a Baha'i.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I actually texted her. I'm like, oh my gosh, Robert Stockman just talked about your ancestor.
Yeah. William Jennings Bryan, very interesting man. Really very, very interesting man.
Really?
A very significant fellow. Yeah, he ran for president.
Yes.
He lost twice.
Yeah.
Then he was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson until World War I began, and he was a pacifist, so he resigned when World War I began. He then went on to become the stated clerk for the Presbyterian Church, which is like the position of president for that denomination. Was really very active and fairly conservative Christian. And then, of course, in the 1920s, when the teaching of evolution was banned in Tennessee, that young teacher named Mr. Scopes taught it and then was put on trial for teaching evolution, right? It's called the monkey trial. And William Jennings Bryan went down there to support the prosecution of Scopes. And in order to uphold Scopes, the American Civil Liberties Union sent down, I can't remember his name, Clarence Darrow, I guess it was, who was the famous prosecuting attorney to protect civil rights. And Darrow and Bryan had a notorious, famous confrontation in the courtroom where Darrow cross-examines Bryan and asks him all kinds of questions about the book of Genesis that Bryan can't answer. And Bryan is immensely embarrassed by this. Of course, Scopes is found guilty and fined $50. And then William Jennings Bryan dies of a heart attack a few days later, quite dramatically.
Oh,
So it's quite an interesting story about
I see a
William
movie
Jennings
there.
Bryan.
I see a movie.
But William Jennings Bryan visited Abdu'l-Bahá, you see. That's the thing that's interesting. In
Right,
like 1906 or 1907, when Bryan was touring the Middle East, he came to Acre and he met Abdu'l-Bahá.
Yes.
And so then Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to reply and return the favor and meet him. So he goes to Lincoln, Nebraska to meet William Jennings Bryan. But William
He wasn't
Jennings Bryan,
home. He wasn't home, right?
because he was on the campaign
Okay.
trail.
Oh,
Because Taft was running against Wilson, and so was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had been president from 1900 to 1908. He didn't feel he could run for president anymore because there was no law saying you could only be president for 2 terms, but that was the custom. Taft had been his vice president, so Taft is president. Taft is then running for re-election in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt thinks Taft did a terrible job, low energy or something. So he decides to run against Taft. That splits the Republican vote, and so the Democrat, who is Wilson, wins. So that's the history of what happened. And Bryan was a Democrat and then becomes Secretary of State. So he's campaigning for Wilson at the time.
but I think it's so interesting that his ancestor ends up becoming a Baha'i.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Right. Yes, I agree, Peter. Rob is a walking history book. I was thinking the same. How in the world do you keep all this straight in your
Well, I
book?
just sort of pick it up and then I don't forget it afterwards sometimes.
Well, that must be nice.
Well,
Sorry,
I think
go ahead,
all it gets to be too much.
Oh, you're fine. Says, thanks. I am inspired to write about the master and his impact on women. How can I go about that?
Well, it would be helpful to get a degree in women's studies, I would say, first of all, and the history of women's studies. What I would like people to do, frankly, is they need to go find archives of materials about women. And I'm sure there were various women's organizations, prominent women's organizations. Abdu'l-Bahá spoke to like 2,000 women in Chicago, and it was a women's organization that organized that talk, and various Chicago Baha'i women were involved in it. I'm sure that archives exist for that organization. There were women's magazines, all of the archival materials about the suffragettes. Is Abdu'l-Bahá appear in any of that material? Do people say anything about this Eastern man talking about their rights? Maybe some do. And if so, what did they say? That I don't know. And someone needs to do a lot of digging. Some of that stuff may now be on the web. So it may be possible to just simply search through records with Google. But there's an awful lot of stuff out there. And it'd be a lot of sifting to find what impact Abdu'l-Bahá had on the women's movement at that time. So that would be a really important piece of research.
Dr. Stockman, thank you very much. What distinctions, if any, between the U.S. and Canada were addressed during Abdu'l-Bahá's visit?
Distinctions, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure Abdu'l-Bahá spoke about the characteristics of Americans and Canadians separately. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. Certainly there are plenty of places where he talks about the characteristics of Americans, but I don't know if he said anything about Canadians. And of course, the only way to have said anything about Canadians would have been to spend enough time there to have anecdotes to share. And he was in Montreal for 8 or 9 days, 10 days, something like that. So if he had anything to say about the character of Canadians, he would have said it probably there and then, and maybe sometime immediately thereafter. I think his famous statement about the character of Americans is his comment about the phrase, all right. He says, everybody loves to use this phrase, all right. Everything is always right in America. How are you doing? I'm all right. Can I help you with this? No, I'm all right. And he actually talks specifically about this phrase, all right, and how optimistic Americans are. And it is a kind of interesting observation. This has been something that many observers observed about Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries, is that America was a very optimistic place compared to Europe, where people tended to suffer more from poverty and had less opportunity to get ahead. And of course, we're only talking about mostly white people. Let's remember that.
Yeah.
But amongst the white people, there was this very much this sense of optimism and this sense that they could make their lives better. And it helped, again, for white people to have courts that were reasonably fair and weren't corrupt and that sort of thing. So in that sense, the white population of America was in a good position compared to people around the world. And it did tend to make them optimistic.
Interesting.
And I think that trickles down to everyone else too, to some extent. I think it did tend to give people a sense of hope if they were more oppressed.
And Perry says, and at Greenacre, he specifically expressed delight at that phrase, all right.
I forgot about that.
Cool. That's so cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Interesting how these questions are kind of flowing together. It's like everybody's on the same wavelength. The next question is, do we know if any significant prejudice or discrimination was directed at Abdu'l-Bahá or his entourage while he was in the United States, and if so, how he addressed it?
Well, that's a really interesting question, actually, and an important question. There was one incident I can think of when they were in Glenwood Springs in Colorado. Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to have the table where he would eat moved out of the restaurant into the garden. And apparently after that, they started serving people in the garden. That's what they say. So Abdu'l-Bahá wanted the table moved out of the garden, and the waiters were surprised that he wanted his Japanese butler to sit with them, because Fujita was on that trip. He wasn't Abdu'l-Bahá's butler or a servant of Abdu'l-Bahā's at all. He was just part of Abdu'l-Bahā's entourage, and this was discomforting for the waiters, because this was not something that was supposed to be done, but they allowed it. Another example of discrimination was the Baha'is in New York City planned a big banquet at the Great Northern Hotel for the Day of the Covenant. It was actually later than the Day of the Covenant, because Abdu'l-Bahá, I think, was in New York at the time of the Day of the Covenant, so it was like December 5th or so. And as they were preparing for the banquet that day, and all the invitations had gone out, the hotel said black people can't come in. So they were stuck with the arrangements. So they had a separate banquet the next day for the African Americans. And it was held in the Kinney House, and the white people served the African Americans.
Nice. So
that was all they could do, because they already had, plans were already underway and people were ready to arrive when they were still told that black people couldn't go to the bank. So there was that. I think one of the reasons Abdu'l-Bahá avoided hotels and stayed in private houses that he rented was exactly this, because of the issues of discrimination. People generally did not have prejudicial opinions towards Abdu'l-Bahá. And there's actually a very interesting comment when Abdu'l-Bahá was interviewed by Kate Carew. She was a prominent newspaper columnist writer, kind of like Barbara Walters or some of these other well-known women who interview people on TV today. And you can go look Kate Carew up, and she interviewed the Wright brothers, and she interviewed a lot of people about their things. And her interview with Abdu'l-Bahá is absolutely delightful, because she keeps saying that she's tempted to poke fun at him, and then she realizes she really can't. And at one point she's really tempted, oh, this is a great opportunity. I can write this one up in my column. And Abdu'l-Bahá looks at her and says, you people must take this very seriously. Just as she's thinking, this is my chance. This is something I can write that will be kind of like a little funny. And he kind of senses it, and he shoots it down right away. So, and then Thornton Shea says, even Kate Carew liked him, She, I guess, had a reputation for panning or criticizing some of the people she interviewed. So it was very hard for people to actually criticize Abdu'l-Bahá when they met him. That was very clear.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Stockman. It is 1:30, and I know that you have another webinar to now go host with Wilmette Institute. Thank you, Chris and Bahá'í Publishing Trust, so much for co-hosting this with us and pulling this off. Thank you, Dr. Stockman. I think people, they just kept coming in the chat. Just thank you so much. So appreciative. There's a lot of appreciation there for all the work that you're doing. And I think it illuminated people's understanding of Abdu'l-Bahá and their relationship with him, according to what they're saying. So I think this was a great success.
Good. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm putting in the chat, Greenacre is hosting another program tonight. It is a live meeting. It's connected to our art show, Just, Diverse, United, The Destiny of America. We're having a discourse space around the use of poetry in creating this Just, Diverse, United society. We've got 3 fantastic poets tonight. So please, if you all want to come with that, you are most welcome. You can register. And have a great day, everybody. We hope to see you back, Dr. Stockman, especially in person when we reopen. We hope to see all of you. Yes. All right.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.